So in this next presentation, this is a lot of material, or at least it represents a lot of material, boiled into one, I guess, 30 to 40 minute presentation. One thing that they've talked about doing was to have a TMDL Academy so that we could go in depth into this kind of stuff. But for this presentation, it's a little bit surface oriented, and we'll do our best. We're going to cover 303D program and TMDLs, basically, integrated reports, lists, and TMDLs, and that kind of thing. I'm Dave Guiliano. I work in EPA Region 9 in the TMDL program with Terry, and I sit next to Joe Morgan. And I am the TMDL 303D coordinator for the region, and that's kind of what I do. I think about these things, and also liaison to the Regional Board 7 and to Nevada. So we do water quality standards and TMDLs and 303D listings, that kind of thing. So that's who I am. Anyway, these disclaimers, wow, they were given to me, but anyway, I guess it boils down to, if in my simplification during my presentation, that the guidance and the policies and the regulations and the laws are the deciding thing, and not maybe an errant word, but hopefully there won't be any errant words. So anyway, we'll go to the overview. And so it's basically a brief introduction to Clean Water Act 303D. We'll learn about sort of the Clean Water Act process framework and basic requirements of 303D listing, integrated reports, and TMDLs. And then we will touch a little bit on where to find things, and I'll know what ATTAIN stands for. Well, actually, I have it written down, because I still can't keep it in my head. Anyway. Let's see here. All right. Well, this is a fun diagram. And the idea is that the 303D program basically is a link. It helps take the information that you have and the standards that you have, and it helps identify your impairments, your pollutants, your problem waters. And it also has a tool, the TMDL tool, to come up with a plan for restoration. And that's the key. And then that plan kicks off a whole bunch of other things, or it can. Some things mandatory, like it gets reflected in permits. Other things not necessarily mandatory, or mandatory by the state, not by EPA, like non-point source requirements and so forth. So anyway, we'll jump right into what is the 303D list. So basically, how many people are roughly familiar with the 303D list? Just raise your hands. Okay, everybody, most people know, but we'll keep in mind those who might not. So there is basically an impaired waters list, water bodies with pollutant impairing a use. Remember from the water quality standards part of the training, if you have a pollutant impairing a use, say some sort of bacteria impairing a recreation use, you get a 303D listing, basically. And every 2 years, each state and territory has to submit a 303D list and basically list all the impaired waters that require a TMDL. That's the simplified. We'll get into more detail on that later. But basically, it's waters that aren't meeting a water quality standard, and you identify a pollutant for that. And also threatened waters, which is, you can read that description we'll get to that, or maybe I'll just say it right now. Let me see. Yeah, it's basically a threatened water is water that is expected to be non-attainment in 2 years or within the next 2 years. So anyway, okay, we'll get into more stuff as we go. So this is how are waters placed on the 303D list. It's basically, this is a big topic, but it's a big part of what we do, at least in regional office. We oversee the states and the territories as they develop their 303D lists. And the operative question is whether something is attaining a water quality standard or not. So I guess the simplified answer is if you have a numeric standard or a narrative standard, if you're basically violating that standard in that water for a given pollutant, it goes on the list. So if it's nutrients, if it's a particular compound, maybe it's aluminum or bacteria, enterococci, something like that, then it gets on the list. And of course, the devil's in the details, right? There are different listing thresholds, basically a tighter listing threshold for toxic pollutants. For conventional pollutants, there is I don't want to say looser, but not as tight. Roughly, 10%, I guess is a...
It's 10 for toxic in California, 10 for toxics and 15 for conventional.
Yeah. So, and then there's some states have what you call a binomial distribution. They have basically a table that they've set up, and that binomial will tell you, based on how many samples you have, whether to list or not. And it's a table for toxics and a table for conventional pollutants. So, and the main thing the binomial helps you do is helps you avoid listing, or at least minimize the risk of listing based on false positives. Because the smaller number of samples you have, the greater potential error that they are representative. That's a basic thing. But not all states and territories use a binomial. And this is sort of part of a state methodology. And let me see if I want to talk about that right now. So the other thing about the 303D list is it's not only listing, but it's delisting is a big deal. And so we at EPA, we review not only what you choose to delist, we look at what you choose not to list. So say you review data and something isn't listed right now, but you review data and we're aware of it, then we will check, or at least spot check, to see that your assumptions are good and that we agree that the use isn't impaired and the pollutant isn't violating water quality standards. So this is every 2 years. It's actually due on April 1st. We don't get a lot of them on April 1st exactly. Most come in the second or third. No, kidding. We have goals. But let's see what we got. There's so much material in this. But let me talk a little bit about the rationale for listing. If you delist a pollutant, you say it's either meeting water quality standards, or there's some other ways you can say. You can delist based on state determining that water quality standard is being met, or that there are flaws in the original listing. There's also this one. Other point source or non-point source controls are expected to meet water quality standards. It's basically actions are, and required actions, if you will, are going to address the problem. Impairment due to a non-pollutant. So there's who's familiar with the sort of pollutant versus pollution, or this? So sort of, if I had to simplify, sort of a man-made or man-caused or human induced either cause pollutant or a reaction in the water, and but some things aren't, and those can be potential 4Cs, as we call them. I'll get to what the 4 means, but basically you wouldn't necessarily have to say they need a TMDL. And then if EPA approves a TMDL, it's not on the list anymore, or if the water body isn't in the state's jurisdiction. Well, let's see. Okay, so let's. The 303D roles. So basically for states and territories and authorized tribes, so we don't have any tribes authorized for 303D program yet, but there is a rulemaking that basically says tribes can apply for 303D authority treatment in state, basically, for the 303D program. A number of them have it for water quality standards. That's 303C. So this is 303D. But anyway, with that said, what are the roles? And so they're mostly laid out for you, but the states have to review all existing and readily available data. So that's really broad. And if you don't, there has to be a valid rationale for not doing so. And it should ideally be written. And then in addition to that, you provide your listed waters. You also have to prioritize those waters. Generally high, medium, or low. In other states, that's what many of them do. Or you can put the year that the TMDL is expected to be completed. That's another form of prioritization. This slide is a little funky because it makes it sound like you have to do both, and it's a little confusing. But anyway, it's basically one or the other. High, medium, low priority, or the year that it will be done. So then let's. And then once we get the list, and we just have 30 days to act on it, which isn't much. So what we at EPA tend to do is we try to see as much of the list as we can well before it gets to us officially. We look at your public drafts. We ask states to share basically working drafts so that we can kind of see what the issues are and what the decisions they're making are, so we can review them. But we don't actually review every single decision you make. We have more of an oversight role. So there's that. And then,
actually, Dave, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm curious to just see when would EPA like to comment at our regional board hearings on any of this, or is it better not to make a judgment at that point? Because a lot of times our board members are interested in some of the controversial decisions. Would EPA support us on this decision? So we'd like to at least informally ask for your opinions, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you do that.
We used to do that, and it's a little bit of a complicated question, but the one thing is we can't make a decision in advance of when it actually comes to us to decide. But we can also point out where things are consistent with or appear to be consistent with our guidance, policy, or regulations. So the answer is maybe yes, maybe no. It really depends on the context, and possibly if something wasn't going to end up on the list unless we said something, maybe we would weigh in a kind of a general kind of way without necessarily pre-deciding, if you will. Yeah. Is that someone else have a question?
So you were saying that we can come up with either a prioritization list or a timeline?
Yeah, but your timeline by EPA, the timeline is considered a prioritization, because if you list that this TMDL will be done in 2022 and another one will be done in 2028, essentially you have given us a priority.
My question then is, if you have a timeline set up and over the course of however many years since you set that deadline for yourself, the priorities change, can you reassess what your deadlines are or something like that? Do you see what I'm saying?
Generally, yes. We get into other topics like, are you taking too long? And that's probably for another day, and maybe another presenter. It's a hard one. But generally speaking, I think the rule of thumb is the prioritization is not approved or disapproved by us. You just have to have it. So we don't actually take action. We don't say, no, that priority is wrong, and disapprove. We only act on listings, basically your 303D list, whether it has the requisite listings or not. Jess?
I just wanted, that topic came up at our joint TMDL integrated report roundtable because some of the regions have been putting this 13-year date from the time of listing because of some EPA guidance. I'm looking to Rebecca since Lori's not here. I thought we had to put a date in there, or is that just something we've been doing? Is that part of our listing policy, or is that just something we've been doing?
So putting in a date certain by which we expect to have a TMDL adopted into our 303D list is not a requirement of the listing policy. I think it's more of a tradition based on, I think it's the 2006 guidance. Is that right? I could be wrong on the date.
Well, it's actually in the regs. I think it's in the statute that it be prioritized.
So you're right, though, Jesse. We had a really good conversation about this just within the last month or so about how do we reflect a little bit more honestly, I would say, when we expect to get to some of the impaired waters, when we're going to do a TMDL or some other control action. And I do think it's worthwhile for us to, when we adopt a new 303D list, to update those dates to reflect our current priorities, and be a little bit more honest with the public as to when we expect to be able to get to these impairments. So we're looking at some different options so that we can be consistent across all of the regions about how to reflect that, as it's going to be, we expect to complete it in the next 2 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, past that. Maybe I am interested to hear that you say other states do a high, medium, low. So it's something that we're still kind of figuring out how to be consistent in how we do it, but also be a little bit more honest about what our expectations are.
I think some of the regions were concerned about the perception of saying something's a low priority. I seem to recall that came up, that they were worried about that, so I didn't know if that was an issue. But
Yeah, nobody wants to hear that their favorite river is a low priority.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if we set a date on there, then it potentially opens us up to liability, because we said we were going to do it by such and such a date, and we didn't do it by such and such a date,
That's
and
right.
therefore we're going to sue you because you didn't do it by such and such a date.
That's right.
It actually doesn't open us up to any legal liability. Folks can bring to our attention that the development of a TMDL is contrary to our projected prioritization. And a perfectly acceptable response would be, in the next listing cycle, we're going to be evaluating our prioritization as we do every cycle, and we may adjust that or revise it, or indeed we will maintain it as a priority and get to it as our priorities allow. But it's not a hard and fast trigger or a deadline. And I don't think it's so much as Rebecca is about being honest with the public. I think it's just an issue of being more thoughtful in our prioritization, yes. Because I think we slipped into an institutional practice of defaulting to a 13-year, presuming that was sort of the default. And I don't think much more thoughtfulness was given to it beyond that. So I think we're just going to be taking a more closer look at it.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, no, didn't want to imply that we were deliberately lying. That's for sure.
Right, of course. So 303D list is actually just one part of the required reports. So basically, we ask for an integrated report. Our guidance asks for it. And the integrated report has the 303D list, which EPA actually reviews and takes action on. We approve and disapprove. The 305B, 314, I'll just emphasize the 305B, is more informational. Now, we may take something from the 305B report, which is the assessment of all waters, and we may decide to add to your list based on something we've encountered in the 305B assessment. Or we may just look at one of those waters that the state has determined isn't impaired and will say otherwise. So, but the integrated report the idea was to synchronize these. And as Terry brought up yesterday, it was a really important point. So in the old days, before we did integrated reports, we had a 303D list, and it was only the bad waters that needed TMDLs. There was never any good water on a 303D list. So it was, and if you restored water quality, it left the list. So there was no good news in that story. And so the integrated report actually gives you some advantages, which it shows all assessed waters. And it also tracks, waters that are good and become bad. You can track the progress of those waters in these reports, looking every 2 years, and vice versa, waters that are restored the same way. So that's the advantage to the integrated report. We use guidances to basically kick off each integrated report cycle, as we call it, in even numbered years. And the one that outlines the integrated report requirements, I think the best, is our 2006 guidance. And if you ever ask me for it or for information on how to do an integrated report, I'll probably send you the CALM, and also, which is the Consolidated Assessment and Listing Methodology, which is a very important document, a very long one, and also the integrated report guidance from 2006 in particular, because it outlines these 5 category reports that we're all kind of living with these days. Yeah.
So I understand that the 305 integrated, or the 305 portion of the report goes to Congress, and I think the Clean Water Act language is that it's transmitted to Congress. Is that a collection of all of the states' 305B report, and is it transmitted to Congress, and where can I locate that online? Because I've never seen an actual transmitted document.
I'm going to kick it to Terry.
So all of the information is put into this big database called ATTAINS, which has an acronym. But what's happened in the last 5 or 6, maybe 8 years is that headquarters has stopped using the data from the states to do their report to Congress, largely because it's apples and bananas. And so what they've been using in their report to Congress is the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, which is basically apples to apples across the country.
So regarding the apples to oranges, if we played apples to oranges, that's a good variation on that game. But the integrated report, so you can imagine, states have their own standards. Every state and territory and tribes that have standards, they all have different standards. So how do you do an integrated report? How do you roll up all that data and basically look at it as one unit? And this has been the problem, and was one of the reasons we went to integrated reports was to address that. But one of the reasons we went to 5 categories is to also kind of communicate that. And I don't know how visible this is. I guess it's not too bad. So imagine if you have, for a given water, a single category assignment. So basically the list is category 5. It's impaired or threatened and needs a TMDL. That's that. And the default is, if it's impaired, it needs a TMDL. If it's impaired, the state or territory will have to basically prove that it doesn't. And that's not an easy process most of the time. But anyway, there are other impaired. It's category 4. You see 4A is the TMDL's done. So you don't require one if it's done. And 4B is this TMDL alternative. That's this combination of actions will address it and cause water quality standards to be met. That's a very hard one to get through us. But it is an alternative, but it's basically the regulatory equivalent of a TMDL, and I would say even more than that. And then 4C is non-pollutant causes. So you see, yeah.
I'm sorry, this is actually from the previous slide. I'm just kind of over here. You can't see me. I was just wondering if you could repeat that acronym, and I didn't mean to get you off course, but for CALM.
Consolidated Assessment and Listing Methodology. That's a really, it was very helpful, especially when I was starting in the program. You can just search CALM, EPA, 303D list, something like that. Back there.
So in San Francisco Bay region, when we have a water body listed for sediment, we also say it's, we have a water quality objective, which is population and community ecology. Mm-hmm. And we say that objective is not met and it's impaired by pollution, which is degraded habitat complexity. And, we wrap in a restoration approach, but that's not mandatory most of the time, the implementation actions. So for the non-pollutant causes, like degraded habitat complexity, could it be in and of itself a, could it be impaired by just that? Would that be a non-pollutant cause acceptable?
So in that case, would that be a 4C I don't know if that's your question.
You're right.
And because if it's human intervention that has caused that, then I think I would argue that it isn't 4C. It's something like, I don't know, a good example of a 4C, I don't know, if a volcano
caused it. Well, we say channelization,
it.
For example, for rivers, large-scale channelization or...
But it depends if humans had some sort of role in that. So I think that's the distinction.
Okay. And then if TMDL is not needed, then what is the implementation that we can enforce in that case if it's not a...
Well, that's a good question. I think that might be out of my section.
Okay.
I don't know if I give you an easy answer to that, but we could definitely follow up with you
Sounds good.
on the rest of the program.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I can speak to that briefly,
Yeah.
just because I'm familiar with EPA's guidance
Yeah.
and on point. And categorization into 4C does not compel any kind of regulatory outcome. So that's why primarily in the state of California, we keep our waters in Category 5 if there's a pollutant impairment. And because we can do the TMDL and do a regulation to compel cleanup, and then only when we discern that the pollutant is no longer a cause and it's maybe just a pollution-caused impairment, then it goes in 4C, and that acts mostly as another prioritization scheme or to inform us of potential restoration projects down the line, but it doesn't compel anything.
So we've had a lot of discussion on 303Ds, and we also have to talk about TMDLs. So we're going to jump into that, quickly wrap this up. For 303D lists, this is they call it conceptual example. It just shows that when you have a water body assessment unit, it isn't necessarily the whole water body or the whole river or stream. It may just be a segment of it, and to keep that in mind. But I'm sure you all know that. Let's see. And then this is information about attains and how's my waterway, and there's links that you can follow. And basically, one thing is that all integrated reports are need to be submitted through our attains database now. This is a new requirement. And that actually enables us to report to Congress and the public because basically everyone's integrated reports get standardized. An integrated report is basically a collection of decisions about your water quality standards. So are you meeting the rec use of a particular beach? Is it supporting or not supporting? It's the roll-up of all that. Are you meeting a drinking water use in a given water body? Are you meeting the aquatic life use, say, for a salmon habitat? Those things, and all the associated pollutants. It all gets standardized, and we can basically keep track across the country of how many there are meeting and not meeting. And we even have acreage. We count things by catchments now. And we basically keep track of all the impaired catchments and non-impaired catchments, and for given pollutants or just for any pollutant. So that's the importance of attains, and as states are basically trying to figure out how to use attains and submit that way, but we've had something along the lines of 30-some states have submitted through attains now. I think 37. So we're working our way up. Let's see here. Okay. So this is integrated reporting, doesn't require a TMDL. We went over that, requires TMDL. What happens to waters on the 303D list? Well, they get a TMDL, or they need to get one. Once I made a diagram like this, and I felt really silly because when I Google searched it, there was like 10 versions of this because it's been done before. But I don't know if this is very visible, but the circled area is basically this program, actually this presentation. The 303D program assesses waters. We list impaired and threatened waters, develop TMDLs, and then from that, our control actions can be informed by the TMDL. Permits get updated by the allocations in TMDL, and we'll go into that, or non-point source reductions can be informed, and some states actually require non-point source regulations as a result of a TMDL or the need to get a reduction. That one. Here are the elements in a TMDL. You know, I would say the key point to a TMDL is if you have an impaired water, you basically figure out how much that water can assimilate of a given pollutant. And the amount over that is the amount that needs to be reduced. You allocate it to your various sources, and that's the TMDL. And EPA's role, when we look at a TMDL, is we examine whether the state or territory has made the justification or rationale for those allocations. We look at whether we believe that those allocations will result, if implemented, in achieving water quality standards. So there's all kinds of required elements in that, but that's where a TMDL stands or falls. If a persuasive case, if you will, isn't made, that the allocations will result in attainment of the water quality standards, then we would not approve. That's the basic gist of it. And so when we talk about all these details, that's really the key one. But this is a nice little diagram, but it's a lot on it. So let's go here. So what's TMDL? It's calculation maximum amount of pollutant water body can receive, still meet water quality standards. We have to identify the problem as part of the TMDL. Usually it's what the impairment is. We identify the listing. We identify the use that is being impaired by that pollutant listing. And then, let's see, TMDL targets. This is an interesting one, and I had what slide are we on, 11? So I was coming up with a question, which is, say you have a listed pollutant, why might your target be, or your water quality applicable standard be another pollutant? Someone think of an example?
Nutrients, where
Okay.
your targets might be dissolved oxygen and algae, but the pollutants are really nitrogen and phosphorus.
Yeah, good example. So that's one. And we have a really kind of interesting one. I was going to ask Deborah briefly to talk about, for instance, pesticides and toxicity, because we have TMDLs that have the given pesticide that's listed, but we also have toxicity targets in some cases, or something like that. So,
Yeah,
Deborah.
good morning. Boy, this could be an hour lecture. We can do that as a seminar sometime. But I think 2 points on this. One is 2 days ago I talked about how to develop the technical number. And so if we have a 304 technical number, you could use that for the pesticide. Oftentimes we don't have a lot of criteria for pesticides. So we can talk about how to use other numbers for those toxicity thresholds. But the other point I think is important, where we use toxicity testing as a tool, no toxic and toxic amounts. And you'll see on your list the pollutant being identified as toxicity. Really, we need to identify through the TIE process what is causing that toxicity. Well, we know we can identify a specific chemical, and in the past we identified chemical X, diazinon, a pesticide. When you point your finger at a chemical like a pesticide specific in your TMDL, what happens is people start to use other products, right, with other active ingredients. And so we see that what's important in developing that TMDL is to establish a specific target for that pollutant that you had on the list, a diazinon target. You can either elevate that to be a standard if you want to do a 303C part of your TMDL package. But more importantly, it behooves you to include a toxicity, no toxic and toxic amounts, additional target. And we've seen that by Regional Board 2 and Regional Board 5, that because we know that when you look at the USGS reports and monitoring, when we look at an urban watershed or any other watershed, you'll find multiple pesticides. So you're not just solving the problem of what's at hand, but you want to be thinking holistic, because this TMDL process takes a lot of time, so you might as well be inclusive in that. So anybody that wants to talk to me about that, I'll be happy to do so. But those were the 2 points. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Deborah. So the important thing is, I'm sorry, I'm going to save up my questions for just a moment so I can burn through this a little bit. But the important thing is to not be totally constrained by the listing. You absolutely have to address it in the TMDL, but you want to also be forward-thinking and not have to do the TMDL all over again for something very closely related. So it's food for thought. So the TMDL also has to include pollutant source and load assessment. This is the overall load that the water body is getting right now and where it's coming from, what kind of sources. This source categorization and loading is really important, not only to allocate those loads, but on the non-point source side, the degree to which you can not allocate them, but identify those sources, it can inform non-point source actions and help guide which ones are likely to be effective. And then let's see, wayside allocations. So anything with a NPDES permit, if you set a wayside allocation for a point source, that will be reflected in the permit at a later time. And that's actually a little bit more complicated than my simple version. But basically it is required, let's put it that way. And okay, you really want a question there?
So how do you do a waste load allocation for bacteria?
Well, basically a lot of them are done on a concentration based at the standard, but like a lot of other things, you can, well, I guess you wouldn't do a mass-based, but the waste load allocations, you have some flexibility in how you would do them. So you can do concentration-based, mass-based for any pollutant in general, but that's typically what we see with bacteria is concentration-based. So, but you'd have to show that that doing a concentration-based waste load allocation, that you've set the number at a level low enough to cause the water body to attain the standard. So probably take some modeling to basically prove that. So as a general.
I suspect there's more to your question there. If you want to talk about it during a break or something,
Yeah.
we might want to do that.
I know just who we can talk to, too. Let's see. Load allocations. So load allocations for EPA's part, there are load allocations for different types of non-point sources. And they can, and helpfully, if it's helpful if a TMDL actually differentiates between the types of sources. That can help guide 319 grants and non-point source programs. In California, for instance, as you know, they can regulate non-point sources with various things. So a good load allocation with some differentiation of those allocations is helpful. So go through there. The linkage analysis, that's sort of what I was getting at, which is basically what EPA looks for. It's the sum total of these allocations. Does that make sense? Is that going to cause the water quality standards to be met? That's the key when we review a TMDL. Is just that rationale there? In here. And then, so there, in the TMDL, there's a lot of decisions you have to make. In our 10-minute version, some of this is just going to breeze by you, but you know, you basically, these are the elements and the decisions you have to deal with. And the fact that some pollutants are more amenable to mass-based loads and some more concentration-based loads. Some require things like toxicity allocations, or you know, things that may not be apparent at first. Just, it's hard to generalize effectively because there are so many different ways that TMDLs have been done across the country. And that's your TMDL calculation. Now notice there is the waste load allocation and the load allocation. There's also a margin of safety. So margin of safety is, well, this is not an exact science, unfortunately. So margin of safety is designed to actually put a factor that increases the protectiveness of the TMDL. If our assumptions are wrong, I don't want to call it a fudge factor, but I guess I just did. But the margin of safeties tend to be, I would say, implicit mostly, rather than like a 10% explicit margin of safety, for instance. That's one example. But I tend to see them as implicit. Basically, either the water quality standards are cited as having some implicit margin of safety, that they're a little bit overprotective in some ways, and or other calculations are either very tight. So they usually say things like, based on conservative assumptions, that the margin of safety is implicit. But don't get too fast and loose on that, because you know, we will be looking at it to see if that is legitimately described.
Hey, Dave, can I chime in here real quick?
Sure.
On the margin of safety, after thinking about what I heard earlier this week about climate change, and that the margin of safety now may be a real nice opportunity for us to explicitly provide more capacity in that calculation when you're doing your margin of safety, to say, we don't know what's going to happen with increased temperatures, with different rainfall events, and then use that as another tool for us to be able to build in some capacity for changes that might happen with climate change. Just something that I was just thinking about based on what I heard earlier this week.
What I think you could do that, I think there's another aspect to TMDL, which are seasonal variations and critical conditions. So your TMDL can't just be written for normal conditions or expected conditions maybe, but seasonal variations and critical conditions have to be accounted for. And so if there are low flow regimes or various things that happen, your TMDL should account for those and meet water quality standards during those conditions too. So that's where climate change, I guess, can be addressed through that. If, for instance, if those happen more often or something like that. Let's see. So you see the various TMDLs are expressed as mass, toxicity, energy, their appropriate measure. We use concentration-based is one kind of shorthand thing we say. Technically, they are required as expressed as daily loads, and we're supposed to express them as daily loads if the state hasn't. We're supposed to be able to translate those. Keep that in mind if you need to do your TMDL in some other temporal scale, that it does at some level need to be translated into that in some way. So we can talk about that if you have a specific issue with that. Water quality modeling is a big deal. If you're doing a TMDL, especially a complex TMDL with lots of sources, you're probably going to require modeling to say you can meet the standard. There's margin of safety. And this is what happens after TMDL is done. And this is sort of the key to the vision, too, the EPA vision for TMDLs. Point source, those allocations for point sources get reflected in the permits. And non-point source, although there aren't federal enforcements, there are other ways to get those non-point source or load allocations achieved. Public participation, this is something that EPA actually reviews for. We make sure that your TMDL development process has had an opportunity for the public to participate, to comment, and we even look to see if you've adequately responded to comments. And then this is getting at the vision. How many people have heard of the TMDL Vision? Sorry. Okay, not that many. EPA basically has, in the last 6 years, has created the TMDL Vision, or the new vision for the 303D program. And the idea is to coordinate all our actions so that we're working together and using all our authorities and abilities to restore water quality. And the way TMDLs fit into this is, so TMDLs are self-implementing, as they call them. They force point sources to reduce their discharges based on the waste load allocation. But we don't want to just ignore the non-point sources anymore. And we want to make sure that the TMDL has enough information to cause reductions in non-point source discharges, and to do what we can to make the TMDL effort helpful in the non-point source context. So having more detail on your load allocation side, better description of your source analysis on the non-point source side, all that is really important, including having a fairly detailed implementation plan that says what people can do, or what parties can do what actions for what commensurate benefit to the water quality. So that's the key there. I see a question.
How are EPA and states tracking implementation of TMDLs and ensuring they are being implemented? I work with one state that has a lot of problems in their permit program, for example.
EPA does track permits and permit renewals, and we have an established program for that. I think with non-point sources, it's, I don't know that it's as consistent, but I think we're basically trying to get there, where we are trying to develop a database that tracks our implementation actions. And some states are doing that too. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier in the presentation that none of the tribes in Region 9 EPA have designated 303D authority, I guess. So what's EPA's role when you're dealing with a impaired water body that flows through tribal lands?
Yeah, and that 303D authority is, no tribe in the whole United States has that at this point. Basically, any TMDL written by a state or water quality standard would need to protect the uses and the water quality standards of the tribal waters too, tribal uses.
So if they have a different water quality standard for the same pollutant, then we develop for that as well?
Yeah, you have to protect the stronger, or how should I say, the tighter water quality standard.
And
so
if
if
there's-
you have a tribe downstream, for example.
Or within the stream, yeah.
Yeah.
And if you have, if they're a potential source, then, you know, we don't regulate the tribes. That's really where my question comes from as well in terms of EPA's role.
Yeah, then you'd come to EPA and tell us. Yeah, and then that would be our responsibility to, do whatever we would decide, I guess. It's hard to know exactly what the situation would be. It's sort of a general hypothetical, but yeah. Because we have the relationship with the tribes, and Loretta is going to present shortly, and she, I think, knows much more about this than I do. But so yeah. So this is the treatment of tribes in a similar manner as states, TAS. So I don't know how many tribes in Region 9 have TAS for standards. Okay, so 18 tribes have TAS for standards, and 6 of them have approved standards. So they get the authority to do the standards, and of course they have to come to us for approval. That takes longer. There you go. Anyway, I'm sort of rushing to wrap up here. So alternatives, and I guess the shorthand answer is the Vision actually encourages alternatives to TMDLs where they are maybe the better decision. And for example, I think the way to characterize it is, how many have heard of Vision alternatives or 5 alts? Some of you? Okay. So my TMDL colleagues have thought a lot about this because instead of doing a TMDL, they might do what's called a TMDL alternative. And basically, we have some guidance on that. But if you know enough about the problem that you need to solve and what actions need to be taken and who needs to take them, that's a key point, and what kind of reductions you can get out of that, then that may be a basis for a TMDL alternative. TMDL is still required, but in the interim, you can do all sorts of good actions that reduce discharges and improve water quality. And the idea for these alternatives is they would need to restore water quality or have a goal of meeting water quality standards, not just making it a little bit better. But yeah, so that is one of the keys to the Vision. And there we go. And so we've been taking questions, but I'll take some more. Yeah.
So does EPA know how, or do they track how effective TMDLs are? Like cost-benefit analysis of, because it takes a lot of resources to do the TMDLs. So I'm just wondering, nationwide, how effective they are.
I don't have a good answer to that as to, we are tracking where we have TMDLs and where we have restoration, trying to track the various activities. But do we have I don't know if we have a cost-benefit analysis for a TMDL in general. That's something we would strive for, but I don't think we have that. Yeah.
Does the National Aquatic Resource Survey, for example, does that incorporate TMDL implementation in some way? Or restoration actions, that if some places restoration has taken place, whether trends are monitored or?
You're asking about the National Aquatics Resource Surveys?
Right, it sounded like that's the overall health assessment of
Exactly.
nation's rivers. So does that incorporate TMDL implementation at all?
It does not, but it does include sampling on tribes. And so when a dot falls on the tribe, it's up to us to contact the tribe and ask them permission to be on their land. But,
Okay, but I guess what I'm asking is following up with the previous question, do we know at all if TMDLs have been effective?
I know they have in some cases, but overall, whether a TMDL is effective or not. First, we know that the wayside allocations are self-implementing, so we know that those reductions have to occur. So in that sense, they've been helpful. And but how much and is it everywhere? Obviously, we don't have that kind of information. As for the NARS, it's just the National Aquatic Resources Surveys. That's sort of a probabilistic measurement of water quality it's a random, basically, selection of points. So if one of those points happens to be where a TMDL is, I guess you could maybe, I don't know, you could learn something, but it's not designed to see the effectiveness of TMDLs per se, I don't think.
So you guys are asking really good questions about the effectiveness of TMDLs. They cost a lot of money, they cost a lot of years in which to get them into place, and I would say that we are not doing a comprehensive, consistent job across the state in looking at and tracking the effectiveness of them. I think we do some tracking at the regional board level to see how well, especially the high priority TMDLs, are working. I think that there's a ton of value in having what I kind of tend to call a watershed steward associated with the TMDL, so you can follow up on implementation. I do not think that they are self-implementing, especially when we have a lot of non-point sources. So you need to have staff that are following up on a TMDL after it's developed, and I think that part of that person's job or people's job is going to be to track how well it's being implemented and if it needs to be amended or revised into the future. One, though, tool that we are starting to find is somewhat helpful in understanding if progress is being made in water quality is, within California again, is the water quality report cards. That kind of look at a pollutant and an impairment and kind of look at a few years of data, comparing it to a TMDL target or load allocate or the actual TMDL number, and seeing if we have any changes over time, and also touch a little bit on what the management practice or practices that may have been that led to those changes. And we're trying to do 3 a year, or at least update one that has been done. So those report cards are available. They're kind of right now our current kind of public-facing tool to kind of show if there's a change. So it's although as I started out this answer by saying it's not a comprehensive or consistent tracking program in place.
And just the closing thought is, the TMDL, when we talk about TMDL effectiveness, that's what the vision is for. That's why I've spent some time in the presentation explaining what kind of elements make a TMDL more effective, to have better fleshed out load allocations, source analysis, and all those things. Basically, TMDL is, what you put into it is what you can get out of it. If you have an idea of what needs to happen in a watershed or water body, and that is in the TMDL. Basically, the actions that need to be taken, how much reduction you'll get from those actions. That TMDL is a blueprint, and it can help guide the restoration process. If a TMDL is very general, doesn't have any implementation, it may be approvable by EPA because the overall number seems like it works, but it may not be very effective because it doesn't tell people what they need to do. So that's the balance in terms of adding heft to your TMDLs. And that's how I'll close. Thanks.
And I can't resist, I'm going to say a few more things on TMDLs. You're going to hear more about impaired waters and TMDL work in California tomorrow morning. That's what some of my session's going to cover. But just one of the key take-home points in California, we do implementation plans when we do TMDLs. So that's a real big difference in our state than in other states, and really provides one of the reasons I say it's not self-implementing, because we include implementation actions that we need to execute and follow up upon.